Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this session called Exploring English for Academic Purposes Feedback Towards New Paradigm Learning Focused Practice by Mr. Joseph Davies, who is a lecturer of English language at Duke Kunshan University. His current research focuses on feedback literacy and EAP pedagogy within Sino-foreign higher education contexts. All right, Mr. Davies, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Jan. First of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a real honour to be back presenting at this wonderful conference again. The organisers have done such a wonderful job, so I'm looking forward to talking with you today. I'll jump straight in and get started. So, quick overview. We'll talk about some feedback assumptions. Then move on to some background and some challenges. I'll tell you a little bit about the methodology for this particular research and explain some of the key results and discussions. And I'm hoping by the end of the talk, we'll be able to discuss some recommendations for your own practice in terms of helping you with feedback in your own roles. So thinking about assumptions, I just have a few very brief questions for you just to think about and reflect upon at the start of this presentation. That maybe perhaps by the end you may have changed your opinion on or things that you might want to reflect on again later. So first of all, what is feedback? So just have a little think about that. In your opinion, what is this thing called feedback? Second question, what is the purpose of feedback? What are we trying to do with feedback? Something we're engaged with a lot in language teaching, language assessing, but what is the purpose of the feedback? Question 3, what is the teacher's role in the feedback process? So thinking specifically about the roles, those of us who are teachers, what is our job in the role of this feedback process? And then finally, one more question to think about. What about the student's role in this feedback process? Are there different expectations of these roles? Okay, so a little bit of background and some challenges that might help frame this research. So clearly feedback is very important. According to Hattie and Timperley, it has the potential to make one of the biggest differences to learners, particularly in higher education contexts. Coming back to that first question, what is feedback? According to Carless and Boud, so David Carless in Hong Kong and David Boud over in Australia, they have a lot of really useful research linking to feedback. And they suggest that feedback is a process, and it's a process where learners are making sense of information, but that information is coming from various different sources. And the important part is that learners are using that information to actually either improve their work or improve their learning strategies. They also argue that feedback is not about justifying grades that we give to students, but instead helping them improve their future work. So maybe that comes down to the timing of feedback, comes back to the purpose of feedback. It should be hopefully about improvement and development rather than this grade justification. And another important point, in order for this information to actually be categorized as feedback, students really need to use that information. So if our students are not actually using that information to improve, is this information actually feedback? Well, according to Carless and Boud, no, it is not. So that brings us to a few challenges. It's been reported that teachers and students, they hold divergent views of what actually is feedback, which can actually cause some problems when it comes to learning. Especially in the UK, Hong Kong and Australia. For example, in the UK, in higher education, we have the Student Satisfaction Survey, and it's quite commonly reported that students are dissatisfied with feedback within their higher education courses. Similarly, teachers, especially we language teachers, we spend a lot of time providing feedback, assessing our learners, and teachers have reported being not very happy with the amount of time they're having to spend, the time commitments of feedback, and also their students' lack of engagement in the process of feedback. So those of you here, you may resonate with this idea of you provide feedback to your learners, and it's quite obvious that in maybe the next stage of a project, your learners haven't actually used that information, and that causes real frustration. Johnson had a nice synthesis of how students use feedback and came up with 5 key challenges, suggesting that feedback needs to actually be useful and specific for learners. Students prefer very specific comments, detailed comments, and individualized, personalized comments. There is an emotional impact related to feedback in terms of the criticism students receive. How do they manage the affective factors of receiving criticisms on their work? Also found that students are actually sometimes confused with what strategies to use to implement feedback comments. And particularly for our context, we're here speaking about language assessment, there is often a linguistic inability to understand the kind of meta language and feedback language that is often used, especially within those second language learning contexts. So then, what is the solution? Can we fix these problems? Well, the current research suggests that if we're involved in assessment and we're involved in feedback, we should try our best to develop or to enhance within our teaching the following. We've got student feedback literacy, and Carless and Boud's paper is excellent for this, a real nice overview for those of you who would like to learn a little bit more. They define student feedback literacy as the understandings, capacities, and dispositions that students need in order to make sense of information to enhance their work or learning strategies. So it links to that previous definition I mentioned. We should also try and enhance our own teacher feedback literacy. So those of us who are teaching, we're designing the assessments, we're designing the feedback mechanisms and the processes. We ourselves should try to develop our own knowledge, our expertise, and our own dispositions in the feedback design process. And we should be designing feedback in ways which help student uptake of feedback and help seed that previously mentioned student feedback literacy. So as we design our assessments and we're providing our feedback or designing our feedback approaches, how can we do that in a way that is going to help our students develop their own feedback literacy? There's a current paradigm. Winstone and Carless have an excellent recent book out. I would highly recommend having a look at that. It's full of useful tips and ideas and suggestions. And they argue that we should be now in a paradigm of learning focused feedback, where the focus is not necessarily on the assessment of students and that justification of grades, but instead it's about the development and the learning and the process of using that feedback for improvement. So can we shift more towards a learning focused paradigm of feedback? And there's this concept of maybe feedback becoming more of a social constructivist approach. So how can we share responsibilities more between teachers and students? What should those responsibilities be? Can we be explicit about those responsibilities? It should be about co-constructing knowledge together, shared understandings between the teachers and the students, and really emphasizing the students' active role in the process. So in terms of current teacher feedback literacy, there's a nice paper by Carless and Winstone. They have 3 dimensions to a framework of teacher feedback literacy. They talk about the design, the relational, and the kind of emotional and personal, and the pragmatic dimensions. So how can we save time? How can we be efficient? And a really nice paper recently by Boud and Dawson. They analysed discussions with 62 teachers in Australia, and they had a chat with them and found that there were 19 distinct competencies of feedback literate teachers. And they categorised those according to kind of macro competencies, meso, and micro. So a couple of really useful articles if you're interested in learning a little bit more. So in terms of what we need to be looking at, there's not a lot of attention that's being given to Sino-foreign contexts. We might want to also think about more specific conceptualization for second language contexts, especially if students are transitioning to this kind of Sino-foreign university where there are completely new linguistic, social, and educational environments. Maybe we need to investigate more about how the feedback works within that context. So in today's presentation, I'm really just focusing on this research question here. To what extent do EAP teachers' feedback practices demonstrate feedback literacy? And how did I do that? My university, Duke Kunshan University, it's a Sino-US liberal arts university in Kunshan, Jiangsu. I worked with my English for academic purposes colleagues, and I had 7 semi-structured interviews with my colleagues. They also provided some feedback documentation in the interviews. And that's a really nice method, according to Jiang and Yu, because they argue by asking somebody to bring feedback documentation to the interview, this is actually situating self-reported evidence and comments into concrete feedback activities. Interviews were transcribed and they were thematically analysed following Braun and Clark's recommendations. I mapped the results to the current feedback literature and came up with a slightly more appropriate feedback, teacher feedback literacy framework that is appropriate for second language contexts and English for medium of instruction, Sino-foreign context as well. And you can see a tick, a dash, and an X. So what I did when I mapped this framework out, I then had a look at the results, and if there's a tick, it's something I felt was heavily represented in the results. Then I placed a dash for things that were relatively represented, and I placed an X for areas that perhaps needed more improvement. And we can talk about that a little bit later. So in terms of the results, the qualitative results, here's my thematic map. We're limited on time today, so I'm just going to talk about a few of these areas you can see highlighted in yellow. So one of the salient features was conversations. This was very heavily mentioned by colleagues. There's a few quotes you can see here. One teacher talking about get the conversation going with students, and then students can explain it to you. So you might be a little bit misunderstood of what your students are trying to argue in their work. Get talking to them, let them explain. Another colleague is talking about conversations as a way of connecting emotionally, getting to know people better as another function. So this links to the literature in that conversations have been used by the respondents in order to both clarify and reduce misunderstandings. They're involving students in the feedback process by having conversations one-on-one with their students as well. And they're showing that this is building the relationship, which relates to the previously mentioned relational dimension. So conversation is very important. Let's not just have transmission of information. Let's engage in dialogue. Let's actually clarify and talk to each other with our students. Another salient feature was emotional awareness. So the respondents really showed a strong awareness of the emotional impact that feedback can have upon their students. So you can see the first respondent here adjusts their feedback accordingly. They try to give the students what is most useful for them. Second respondent has a sensitivity to individual differences and needs. Here in China, we don't have to worry about students' emotions too much. That's quite interesting. If you compare that with the final quote says that it's harsh. Students remember it. It really sticks with them, but I try and consider their feelings. So there was a little divergence there between colleagues' respondents. We have on the one side, one individual mentioning we don't need to worry, students can take it here in China. And on the other hand, there was another colleague who really was concerned about criticism and upsetting their students. So it shows that there is personalization, there is individualization of feedback comments. It clearly shows in general an emotional sensitivity, which again links to Carless and Winstone's relational dimension. But there are differing interpretations of the context. Perhaps some colleagues are newer to the Chinese context, perhaps other colleagues are more experienced, but I think this needs a little bit more exploration, and the next phase of this study is to actually talk to students, and that's something I would like to get a little bit more information on. How do students handle criticism? Do they like their teachers to be direct and criticize them for the purpose of improving their work, or would they prefer their teachers to soften the feedback and be a little bit more aware of not damaging their feelings? I think that's an important question. Another salient feature was learner agency. So through the feedback process, the respondents were really trying to encourage independence, encourage their learners to take ownership over their second language writing projects or their second language presentation projects. So a few points from the quotations here: helping learners work through some strategies, making sure learners are clear enough to get the kind of feedback that's going to help them. Second respondent, you're the writer. At the end of the day, this is your piece of writing. You own it. You're the boss. You make the decision on this. So really not the teacher telling the student what to do, but actually the student taking ownership, really pushing that learner agency. And finally, I need to get them ready for next year when they're not going to be in an EAP course and just getting loads of feedback. It is worth mentioning English for academic purposes courses. They are known for lots of feedback provision, process writing approaches, developing through the academic writing process. When the students no longer have EAP courses at our university, they only have them in year one, they're possibly not getting that same amount of feedback. So this teacher is talking about preparing the learners for courses beyond EAP. So we can see here that colleagues are really trying to develop feedback strategies for their learners in terms of different sources of feedback, requesting feedback from people. And that links to Carless and Boud's definition of feedback and that idea of seeding your students' feedback literacy. We can see there's an idea that we're trying to reinforce writers' ownership over the decisions related to feedback. And finally, that preparation beyond EAP courses. Peer feedback was another one that came up quite frequently, was a very important part of the curriculum in this EAP course, looking at something together, walking away with ideas, making it clear to students that it's not only about the information you receive, but often it's the one who is reviewing that is going to actually benefit from this process. But there are contextual factors. The final quote states that from these Chinese students' perspectives, the teacher is the one that has the knowledge. What the teacher says matters, and what my classmates say doesn't matter as much because they don't know. So there is this kind of power distance between the teachers, the one being the authority, and the students. Does it really work if students are working with students? One teacher felt their student didn't feel so. So we're looking at increased opportunities here to make evaluations on academic work through peer feedback, which is beneficial. We're sharing feedback research with students to get that buy-in, telling them that the research shows peer feedback is beneficial. But there are potentially some cultural barriers there relating to this high power distance and the teacher being the authority. I'm just going to skip through a little bit here because we're mindful of time and just jump to the recommendations. So there were 8 recommendations here that link to this newly developed teacher feedback literacy framework. I'm just going to mention them. Each descriptor has, here you can see 4 different descriptors in a little bit more detail. But what we're going to do is just go through briefly and then show just a couple, okay? So first of all, create the ideal feedback environment. And based on this, you can see that 2 of the sections were highly represented in the results. 1 was relatively represented and 1 was not. The second recommendation and feature in this framework was to engage in feedback dialogue with students. So engage in conversations, engage in discussions as much as possible. Third, encourage students to make judgments about academic work, and those judgments can be about samples, they could be about their own work, they could be about their classmates' work through peer feedback, and I think that's something that the respondents were doing relatively well. Encourage students to take action on feedback information. According to that earlier definition, this is probably the most important feature, actually designing our assessments and our feedback in ways that encourage students to use that information to get better. Share those feedback responsibilities. Shouldn't only be about the teacher. Let's get the students involved, give them roles, give them responsibilities in this feedback process. We don't want them to be a passive player. We want them to be active in this process. Help learners understand feedback, especially in a second language learning environment, that meta language that we're using, those correction codes that we may use. How do we really help our learners understand that? And number 2, engaging in dialogue can actually help with that understanding. Number 7, be pragmatic and efficient. This is something that perhaps was not represented in the results to a high degree. How can we improve our efficiency? How can we be quicker? How can we give feedback on areas that are most beneficial for learners? And how can we manage our own time and not experience burnout? And finally, we as teachers should engage with feedback literature. So we're nearly wrapping up now. We've got about a minute left. So I'm just going to very briefly show you a couple, just so you have the context of what this framework looks like. And then I'll end with one quite poignant quote. So you can see here, create the ideal feedback environment. And then you can see it's broken down into 4 descriptors. The ticks indicate the features that were represented well within the results. The dash indicates relatively, and the X is something that could be further developed. So this is something that I've been through, I've shared with my colleagues at university, at Duke Kunshan University, and this is something that I'm hoping to work on for the publication. I don't have time today to go through all 8, but this is something that I thought was quite well done by participants in terms of creating a good environment. And the pragmatism and efficiency was something that wasn't really demonstrated very well. Teachers tended to be taking too much time. They weren't really utilizing technology to help them in the feedback process. And they weren't making the process satisfying for teachers. So that was just to show you a little bit more detail of how these features come together. But being mindful of time, I think I'll end just on this quote from David Boud and Phil Dawson. It's been conventionally assumed that having knowledge of the student matter is sufficient for feedback to be conducted well. But this study shows this is inadequate and that substantially increased levels of pedagogic competence are needed in addition to assist student learning. There is no magic formula for feedback, and as such, no amount of simplistic ticks and tricks or training in specific practices will be guaranteed to improve feedback. What is needed instead is an increase in overall competence in teachers' feedback literacy. So maybe something for us to all reflect on there. But being mindful of time, here are my references. The papers in red are just things I would strongly recommend having a read of. Really accessible, really useful and very helpful papers if you want to learn a little bit more about this area of feedback literacy. But I think that's time, so thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to receiving your questions. If anyone wants to contact me, talk further about this, I'd be very happy to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe. That was a great presentation. For starters, we've got one question here. First of all, how can Johnson's challenges be achieved with standardized feedback when teachers are so stretched?
I think that's a really valid question, and I think we'll just get it up on the PPT. I think a lot of the research, maybe a criticism of much of the research is quite idealistic. Obviously, teachers are completely stretched. It also comes down to class sizes as well. For example, it would be really helpful, this idea of specific individualized feedback. In an ideal world, it would be fantastic if I had 20 students and I could give these 5 students that kind of feedback, the next 5 students that kind of feedback. That would be ideal, but realistically, how can we do that? Especially if you are working within contexts that have, like the question asker said, standardized feedback processes, expectations. Where I'm based, I think I'm quite lucky with Duke Kunshan University. I think we have relatively a large amount of I'd say, kind of freedom as academics. We're free in the way that we can design our assessments and our feedback practices to some degree. Previously, when I've been working for a British university and we have our QAA requirements, our external examiner requirements, there's much more homogeny in terms of the standardization required across teachers within the same module. So I'm not sure, maybe contextually, depending on your teaching context, there may be a little bit more space or a little bit more wiggle room to try these things. Again, I'm very fortunate in my current context. My class numbers are capped to 12 students. So I never have more than 12 students, which is just amazing for me. And that gives me more time and more space to maybe try out a few different things with feedback, maybe have a little bit more time that I can apply to the process. If you're working with 20, 30 plus students, that's going to be very challenging. But I think things like the Johnson's synthesis and the results in that, I think if we just become more aware of the findings that are there, and we can just maybe discuss those with our colleagues, even discuss those with our students, and we have that awareness, maybe we can bring that into the curriculum or the assessment design to some degree. But I would completely agree. Are a lot of these suggestions realistic? Are they feasible?
All right, we have another question here by Kaveh Jalilzadeh. How can we enhance learners' feedback literacy?
Okay, thank you for the question. So let's just maybe jump back. Yeah, the feedback literacy. This is something I think first of all, we just want to, first of all, raise our own awareness of feedback literacy, raise our students' awareness of feedback literacy. Again, contextually, I've been teaching a long time in China, and from my understanding and my experience, many Chinese students who come into university, they've come through this very, very test-focused, accuracy-focused system of preparing for the Gaokao, the college entrance examination. And they've really relied on their teachers at high school telling them what is needed, looking for accuracy, that when they come into university, it's very hard for them to change that mindset. So sometimes it may require, depending on your student's previous educational experiences, it may require almost a retraining or a re-awareness in terms of what feedback can be. So for example, we don't want our students to completely rely on the teacher as giving them the information to improve. We want to instead talk about the importance of self-evaluation, metacognitive reflection. We want to tell our students to think about how they can use their peers, how they can get feedback from other sources as well. And I think this can be done in second language classroom activities. It can be done through things like a really nice point that was mentioned by my respondents was things like interactive cover sheets. That's a great example. So when you have a student, say, hand in an essay, a piece of work, we can design a very simple cover sheet to place on the top of that essay where the students interact with the feedback. They could maybe tell us maybe 2 things that they would like help with, or 1 thing that they think needs developing. They could put on the cover sheet, how have they used previous feedback to include this? So I think through design, classroom design, assessment design, we can definitely do this. But the first stage is just to raise awareness of both of these 2 things, our own feedback literacy as teachers and also our students' feedback literacy. And maybe if there's one thing, maybe just to say, let's not think of this as me, the teacher, giving loads of information to help the students improve. Instead, checking they have used the information to improve, pushing them and nudging them, reminding them to make the improvements as well. That's a good question.
Okay. I've got one other question here by Mark Ritchie. How do you account the culture of face in feedback process, saying that in China, giving face to students is essential?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. I think those of us with Confucius influenced students, whether they're Chinese students or students coming from these cultural backgrounds where face is so important, I think this comes back to the model of feedback literacy I mentioned, whereby the relational dimension is so important. And that's all about the emotional impact and the potential consequences that our comments on their work can have. And I think face is so important, and it goes both ways. There is the giving of face, so we could say, positive comments, complimenting, and then there is that damage of face. And that's what I found was quite interesting in these results, whereby we had two EAP teachers based in China with 2 completely differing perceptions of how their criticisms are going to impact their students. One of them was saying, don't worry about it. These are Chinese students. They can accept criticism. Let's go hard. Let's just tell them what they need to do. Just be critical. Don't waste time. And the other teacher was saying, no, we need to manage this very carefully. We need to compliment them. We need to hedge your feedback and really treat them delicately. And perhaps that comes down to this face. If you criticize a student too heavily, that can have a huge demoting effect. I think this idea of face also comes into the peer feedback process as well. One thing that we tend to find generally, not all the time, but generally as a pattern, even if we train our Chinese students to work with peer feedback, we find that they are overly complimentary to their classmates. And sometimes there are glaring mistakes that haven't been identified in the peer feedback. And when we talk to our students about that, it's often that, well, they just don't want to upset, they don't want to criticize. The social interaction of the group of students in a class is more important than individually upsetting someone. So it tends to be overly positive peer feedback. That in itself is possibly something to look at. I have started talking to students. I've not analyzed my data completely, but I have done some interviews with EAP students for the next stage of this project. And one thing that came up is the importance they feel of having some positive feedback. even if they know their work isn't great, they really felt they want their teachers to give them some positive feedback. And I think that comes down to this concept of face. They've put their work, their energy and their time into this work, especially if it's writing. It can be very personal. And then to overly criticize that writing can be damaging to the person and therefore the face. So I think absolutely for those in China, that's a very important question. I'm glad Mark has raised that. Thank you.
All right, I think that is the end of our session. Thank you ever so much, Joseph, for a great session.
No problem. Thank you, Jan. And thanks for the questions. Yeah, take care. Enjoy the rest of the conference, everybody. Thank you. Take care.